The cowboy looked at the freezing bride on the station platform and asked only one thing before taking her home. Snow slapped hard against the train windows as Evelyn tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. A man in a red scarf shoved folded papers back into his coat and walked away without looking at her again. Across the street, a cowboy beside a wagon full of timber watched her standing alone in the storm, then finally stepped forward. "Can you cook?" he asked. Evelyn's answer made him go completely still. "Tell me where you're watching from before we begin." The train came into Dry Creek, slow and groaning beneath the weight of the storm. Snow swept across the tracks in long white sheets. The engine hissed like something alive, iron wheels, screaming against frozen rails as lantern light flickered through the blizzard. Most folks waiting near the platform had their collars turned high against the wind. Nobody lingered outside longer than necessary in a Montana winter. Evelyn Brooks stepped down last, one worn suitcase in her gloved hand, dark wool coat dusted white at the shoulders, a folded marriage paper tucked inside her pocket so many times the corners had softened from use. The cold hit hard enough to steal her breath for a second. Dry Creek smelled like coal, smoke, wet horses, and pine carried down from the hills above town. Somewhere beyond the station, a church bell rang once through the wind. She spotted Vernon Pike near the end of the platform almost immediately. He stood beneath the awning outside the depot office, with a cigar pinched between two fingers. Thick coat, red scarf, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat while he studied her face. For one brief moment, Evelyn thought maybe things would still work. Then his expression changed. Not surprise, calculation. He stepped forward slowly, boots crunching over snow. "You the woman from Kansas City?" he asked. Evelyn nodded once. "Evelyn Brooks." Vernon glanced around before looking back at her again. His jaw tightened. "You didn't mention being colored in your letter." The words landed flat between them. A couple standing near the freight crates suddenly found somewhere else to look. A ranch hand near the station door lowered his eyes toward the snow. Evelyn kept her chin level. "The agency had my information. Hell with the agency." Vernon gave a short laugh without humor. "This ain't what I paid for." The wind shoved hard against Evelyn's coat. She did not move. Vernon pulled the folded contract from inside his jacket and waved it once like it offended him personally. "I run a respectable place. Men come through my saloon from all over Cedar Ridge. I asked for a wife, not trouble." Nobody interrupted him. Nobody told him to stop. That hurt worse than the cold. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase until the leather creaked softly beneath her glove. She had spent her last dollars getting west. 3 days on trains that smelled of smoke and damp wool. 3 nights pretending not to hear the whispers when passengers noticed she traveled alone. Now this. Vernon shoved the papers back into his coat. "You can try the church boarding house if they got room." Then he walked away. Just like that, his boots disappeared into the curtain of snow beyond the station lamps. The platform slowly emptied after that. People moved around Evelyn carefully, like standing too close might drag them into something uncomfortable. A woman carrying a basket pulled her little boy nearer as she passed. Somewhere down the street piano, music drifted faintly from the saloon before the wind swallowed it whole again. Evelyn stayed where she was. Snow gathered along the shoulders of her coat. The suitcase suddenly felt heavier than it had back in Kansas City. Across the street, a wagon loaded with cut timber stood beside the feed store. 2 horses stamped impatiently against the cold, while a tall man tightened the rope, holding the logs in place. He had broad shoulders beneath a weather-darkened coat, leather gloves. Snow caught along the brim of his hat and the edges of his beard. He looked older than most men working cattle country. Not old exactly, just worn in the quiet way hard winters wear things down. He had been watching, not staring. Watching. Evelyn noticed when he finally crossed the street. The wind pushed hard between the buildings as he stopped a few feet from her, close enough for her to see pale scars across one rough hand where the glove ended. His eyes moved once toward the abandoned tracks, then toward the road Vernon Pike had taken. Finally back to her. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" he asked. Evelyn answered honestly. No, the storm groaned through the valley. Behind them, the station master locked the depot doors. The man looked toward the darkening sky before speaking again. "Can you cook?" Evelyn blinked once at the question. Of all the things she expected after today, that had not been one of them. She studied him carefully, the snow on his shoulders, the tired eyes, the silence that did not feel cruel. "Better than most women who marry for comfort," she said. For the first time, something shifted faintly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. He nodded toward the wagon. "Get in." Evelyn hesitated only a second before climbing onto the seat beside him. The wood beneath her was cold through her skirt. Her suitcase rested between her boots, while the horses pulled them slowly into the storm. Neither spoke for several minutes. Dry creek passed in pieces through blowing snow. Lanterns swinging outside the general store. Smoke climbing from chimneys. Men gathered near the saloon doors with whiskey glasses in their hands. People watched the wagon go by. Watched the stranger sitting beside Cole Mercer. Because that was who he was. Evelyn heard the feed store owner call his name once before they disappeared down the road leading north toward the hills. The storm thickened outside town. Pine trees rose dark against the white valley. Snow hissed across the frozen road beneath the wagon wheels, while the horses pushed forward through drifts gathering deeper by the minute. Finally, Cole spoke without looking at her. "Silver Creek Ranch is another hour if the road holds." Evelyn nodded quietly. "You got family back east?" he asked. "No." After a moment he nodded once like he understood more than she had said aloud. The wagon creaked onward through the storm. Far behind them, standing beneath the yellow light outside his saloon, Vernon Pike watched the wagon disappear into the white dark. His cigar burned red between his fingers. "That girl's still under contract," he muttered. And somewhere beneath the sound of the storm, trouble began moving toward Silver Creek Ranch. The road north climbed slowly into the hills. Snow struck Evelyn's cheeks sideways as the wagon rolled through cedar trees, bent heavy beneath ice. Cole Mercer handled the reins without wasted motion, shoulders steady beneath his coat while the horses pushed through drifts scattering along the trail. Neither of them spoke much. The lantern hanging beside the wagon swayed with every rut in the frozen road. Once, near a narrow bend overlooking the valley, Cole reached across her without warning to steady the suitcase before it slid off the seat. His glove brushed the sleeve of her coat. "Brief. Careful. Road gets slick here," he said. That was all. An hour later, the ranch appeared through the storm. Silver Creek Ranch sat low beneath the mountain ridge with warm light glowing faintly through two front windows. A long barn stretched behind the house beside a line of pine fencing half buried in snow. Smoke climbed from the chimney and vanished into the white sky. The place looked tired, not broken, just tired. Cole climbed down first and tied the horses near the porch rail. His boots sank deep into the snow as he carried her suitcase to the front steps. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke, old coffee, and cold iron skillets. A little girl peeked from behind the staircase railing almost immediately. Small face, light brown curls. One sock sliding halfway down her ankle. She stared at Evelyn with open curiosity. Cole hung his coat near the door. "Lucy." The little girl ducked back out of sight. From somewhere deeper in the house came the scrape of a chair against wood flooring. A boy appeared in the doorway near the kitchen, taller than Evelyn expected. Thin, serious-eyed, Noah Mercer. He looked at Evelyn once, then at Cole. Nobody smiled. "She staying?" he asked. "Till winter passes," Cole answered. Noah nodded like he had learned not to ask more than necessary. He disappeared again toward the back room without another word. Cole picked up Evelyn's suitcase and motioned toward a narrow hallway beside the stove. Room's small, but it's warm enough. The room held a narrow bed, a wash basin, and one wooden chair near the window. Frost feathered the corners of the glass. A folded quilt rested at the foot of the mattress. Evelyn set her gloves carefully on the chair. "You can leave your things here," Cole said from the doorway. "Supper's usually whatever can be heated quick." She glanced toward the kitchen. "What do you have?" He frowned slightly, as if nobody had asked him that in a long while. "Beans, salt pork, half loaf of bread, maybe. That all?" "Mostly." Evelyn removed her coat slowly. "I can work with mostly." Something faint shifted in his expression again. Not amusement exactly. Interest. He gave one short nod. "You stay till winter passes. Nothing more." The words settled quietly between them. Evelyn met his eyes. Understood after he left. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the house around her. The wind pushed softly against the walls. Floorboards creaked somewhere overhead. A child coughed once in another room. A lonely house, she thought. The kitchen shelves held less food than she expected from a cattle ranch. She found dried onions, old potatoes, flour folded tight inside a cloth sack, and a jar of molasses nearly empty at the bottom. She rolled her sleeves without comment and lit another lamp. An hour later, the smell drifting through the house had changed completely. Onions cooking slow in bacon grease, beef broth simmering with pepper and potatoes, cornbread browning hot against cast iron. Cole came inside from the barn carrying an armful of firewood and stopped near the doorway. He said nothing, just stood there a second breathing in the smell. Lucy appeared next, bare feet against the floor despite the cold. "Is that for us?" she whispered. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder. "Unless someone else plans on eating it." Lucy smiled before she could stop herself. At supper, Noah pretended not to care. He kept his eyes on his bowl while snow tapped softly against the windows. Cole ate quietly across from Evelyn beneath the yellow lamp hanging above the table. Nobody talked much. Still, the room felt different somehow, warmer. Later that night, Evelyn woke thirsty and stepped softly toward the kitchen. She stopped near the doorway. Cole sat alone at the table in shirt sleeves with a coffee cup cooling beside one rough hand. The lamp burned low. Snow moved outside the dark windows in pale ribbons. He was eating the last of the stew straight from the pot. He noticed her standing there. For one awkward second, neither moved. Then he cleared his throat slightly. "Didn't figure anybody'd miss it?" Evelyn leaned against the doorway. "That means it turned out right." A quiet, almost smile touched his face. Small, gone fast, but real. Upstairs, Lucy laughed softly in her sleep. And for the first time in a very long while, Silver Creek Ranch did not feel entirely empty. Morning came gray and bitter cold. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the valley buried beneath fresh snow that reached halfway up the fence posts. Frost coated the kitchen windows thick enough to blur the mountains beyond them. Evelyn was already awake when Cole came downstairs. Coffee simmered low on the stove. Cornbread cooled beneath a folded towel beside the counter. She stood near the sink with her sleeves rolled past her wrists, quietly kneading biscuit dough, while the first pale light crept into the room. Cole stopped near the doorway. For a moment he simply watched her move around the kitchen, like she had always belonged there. Lucy sat at the table swinging her legs beneath the chair, cheeks pink from warmth and sleep. Noah leaned against the wall nearby, pretending to sharpen a pocket knife while stealing glances toward the stove. Nobody mentioned how different the house felt. Some things were easier left unspoken. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened again. Another storm was coming. Cole and Noah spent most of the day near the lower barn, trying to move the youngest calves inside before the weather turned bad. Wind screamed down the ridge hard enough to shake the stable doors on their hinges. Evelyn kept Lucy indoors, helping shell beans beside the stove. at least until she realized the little girl had gone quiet, too quiet. Evelyn looked up from the table. The chair near the fire sat empty. The front door hung open 3 inches against the wind. Her heart dropped hard enough to hurt. Lucy? No answer. Outside, the storm had already swallowed the yard in white. Evelyn grabbed her coat without thinking. Snow struck her face the second she stepped off the porch. Wind tore through the pine trees beyond the barn while the last daylight disappeared behind thick clouds. "Lucy!" she shouted again. Nothing. Then she saw them. Small footprints leading past the corral toward the far fence line, half covered already. Cole spotted Evelyn running through the snow and cursed under his breath. "Noah, get inside!" But Evelyn was already climbing over the drift near the lower pasture. The wind made breathing hard. Snow packed into her boots with every step. Once she nearly slipped crossing the frozen creek bed, hidden beneath fresh powder. Then she heard crying. Faint, somewhere ahead. Lucy lay curled beside a broken section of fence, where the old boards had collapsed beneath snow. One small glove missing, coat soaked through. Evelyn dropped beside her immediately. "There you are," she whispered, breath shaking from cold. Lucy threw both arms around her neck so fast Evelyn almost lost balance in the snow. "I couldn't find the barn," the little girl cried. "It's all right now." By the time Cole reached them, Evelyn already had Lucy wrapped inside her own coat, shielding the child from the wind with her body. Cole knelt beside them, breathing hard. For one frightening second, his hand touched Lucy's face, checking for warmth, before his eyes lifted toward Evelyn. Snow clung to her eyelashes. Her hands were red from cold. Still, she held Lucy steady, like letting go had never crossed her mind. Something changed in his face then, something quieter than gratitude. He took Lucy carefully into his arms. "Let's get inside." That night, the storm rattled every window in the ranch house. Lucy refused to leave Evelyn's side. She sat curled beside her near the fire, wrapped in blankets, while Evelyn warmed broth on the stove. Noah hovered nearby, pretending to work on leather tack that no longer needed fixing. At one point, he crossed the room awkwardly and held out a pair of dry wool gloves toward Evelyn. "You forgot yours outside," he muttered. Evelyn looked at him a second before taking them gently. "Thank you." Noah nodded once and returned to his chair without another word. Near Christmas, the storm settled into a quieter rhythm. The nights grew still. One evening, Evelyn sat near the fire, mending a tear along Cole's work coat, while Lucy slept against her shoulder beneath a quilt. The only sounds came from crackling wood and the soft scrape of Noah carving something small with his knife near the lamp. Cole stepped inside, carrying Snow on his boots, then stopped. The sight in front of him held him there longer than he meant to stay. Lucy asleep against Evelyn, warm firelight across her face, the old coat in her hands, home. The thought hit hard enough he almost stepped back from it. Later that night, Lucy woke screaming from a dream. Evelyn reached her first. The little girl stumbled half asleep down the hallway and buried herself against Evelyn so tightly her small hands shook. "Mama!" Lucy cried softly. "Don't leave." Everything in the house went still. Noah stood frozen halfway down the staircase. Cole remained near the kitchen doorway with one hand braced against the frame. Evelyn closed her eyes only a moment before gathering Lucy close beneath the blanket. She said nothing, just held her while the child's crying slowly faded into quiet breathing. No one spoke after that. Not that night. Not the next morning either. But when Evelyn placed breakfast on the table at sunrise, Noah lingered near the stove instead of leaving for the barn. "Miss Evelyn," he started, then stopped. He glanced down awkwardly at the coffee steaming between his hands. "Can you stay for breakfast?" And somewhere deep inside Silver Creek Ranch, another locked door quietly opened. The days after the storm settled into a quieter kind of winter. Snow stayed thick along the ridge roads, but the worst winds passed east toward the plains. Smoke rose steady from the ranch chimney each morning. Now, The house carried new sounds with it too. Lucy laughing over spelling lessons at the kitchen table. Noah splitting wood outside before sunrise without being asked twice. Sometimes even Cole coming through the front door before dark instead of long after supper had gone cold. People in Dry Creek noticed. Small towns always did. By January, Martha Boone at the general store had started setting aside extra flour before Evelyn even asked for it. She wrapped the paper parcels carefully with twine and spoke while counting coins from the register drawer. "That ranch looks different lately," she said one afternoon. Evelyn glanced up from buttoning her coat. "Different how?" Martha gave a soft hum. "Like folks finally started living in it again." Outside, sleigh runners scraped slowly past the storefront over packed snow. Two women near the feed barrels lowered their voices. The moment Evelyn stepped through the door, she heard enough anyway. Mail-order bride, Cole Mercer, Lucy calling her mama. Evelyn kept her shoulders straight and carried the flour sack home through the cold without changing expression once. That evening, she stood at the kitchen counter kneading bread dough, while snow drifted softly against the windows. Lucy sat nearby, drawing crooked stars across scraps of newspaper, with a pencil worn nearly to nothing. Cole entered quietly from outside, carrying harness straps over one shoulder. He noticed the untouched coffee beside Evelyn's elbow. "You all right?" he asked. The question stayed gentle, careful. Evelyn brushed flour from her hands slowly before answering. "Folks in town got plenty to say." Cole hung the harness beside the door. "Folks in town always got plenty to say." A corner of her mouth moved faintly at that. Still, he crossed the room after a moment and pushed the coffee cup slightly closer toward her. Small thing, but she noticed. 3 days later, trouble finally rode through the front gate. Noah spotted the rider first from the barn loft. "Cole!" he called sharply. By the time Cole stepped outside, Vernon Pike was already climbing down from his horse near the porch. Sheriff Dalton Reed followed behind him, looking older and more irritated than usual beneath his heavy wool coat. Vernon brushed snow from his gloves and smiled toward the house like he belonged there. "I came for what's mine." Inside the kitchen, Lucy stopped coloring. Evelyn slowly set down the spoon in her hand. The silence that followed felt familiar in the worst way. Cole stepped forward before Vernon could move another inch toward the porch. "You got business here?" Cole asked flatly. Vernon pulled folded papers from inside his coat. "Signed contract says I do." Sheriff Dalton removed his hat with a tired sigh. Vernon filed through the territorial office before winter. "Legally speaking, the agreement still stands unless compensation's returned." Cole's jaw tightened once. Behind the sheriff, wind moved through the pine trees with a long, hollow sound. Vernon glanced toward the kitchen window where Evelyn stood visible behind the curtains. "I paid good money." Cole looked at him then the way a man looks at something rotten, left too long in the sun. "She ain't cattle." "Never said she was," Vernon smiled thinly. "Still under contract, though." Inside the house, Lucy moved closer to Evelyn until her small hand wrapped tightly around the fabric of her dress. Noah stood near the doorway with his face gone pale and angry. Cole said nothing more after that. He grabbed his coat from the hook beside the door and headed toward the barn. "Cole," Evelyn called softly. He paused but did not turn around. "Stay inside," he said. Then he disappeared into the storm. The sun had nearly dropped behind the mountains by the time he returned to Dry Creek. People noticed immediately. Cole Mercer rode straight through town, leading 3 of his best horses behind him. The big gray mare, the paint gelding, even the black stud he'd spent 2 winters breeding for spring sale. Every rancher in Cedar Ridge knew what those horses were worth. Sheriff Dalton stood outside the bank when Cole climbed down holding a canvas money sack, heavy enough to strain the stitching. Vernon's smile faded the moment Cole pressed the bag hard against his chest. "That settles your contract," Cole said. Coins shifted heavy inside the canvas. Vernon stared down at it, stunned. Cole stepped closer. Cold wind moved between them, carrying snow across Main Street. No woman belongs to a contract. Nobody spoke. Not Martha Boone watching from the store window. Not the men outside the saloon. Not even Vernon. Because every person standing there understood exactly what Cole Mercer had just traded away. Vernon mounted his horse without another word, and for the second time that winter, Evelyn watched him leave her behind. Only this time she wasn't standing alone on a frozen train platform. Cole turned back toward her slowly. Snow rested along the shoulders of his coat. His hands looked red from cold where the gloves had worn thin at the fingers. Evelyn's eyes dropped briefly toward the empty hitch rail where the horses should have been. "You sold them," she whispered. Cole shrugged once like it cost nothing at all, but she saw the truth anyway, the quiet ache behind his eyes. "If you stay now," he said carefully, "stay because you want this place, not because you owe me." Something inside Evelyn finally broke loose then, not loudly. Just one sharp breath before tears slipped free for the first time since Kansas City. Cole looked startled by them, like he'd rather face another blizzard than watch her cry. He took one uncertain step forward, then stopped himself, and somehow that restraint hurt her heart even more. Winter loosened slowly over Cedar Ridge after that, not all at once. The morning still came sharp with frost, and snow remained packed deep beneath the pine trees along the North Ridge. But water began dripping from the barn roof by noon. The creek behind the pasture started moving again beneath sheets of cracked ice. Something else had changed, too. The ranch no longer sounded lonely. Lucy filled the kitchen with constant chatter now. She followed Evelyn from room to room, carrying mismatched spoons or folded towels too small to help much with anything. Noah had grown taller somehow over the winter. He lingered near the stove during supper, instead of rushing back outside the second he finished eating. And Cole had stopped pretending he did not belong there with them. One evening, Evelyn stepped onto the porch, carrying a basket of laundry, warmed fresh from the stove. She found Cole crouched near the front steps with a hammer in one hand and new boards stacked beside him. "The porch was leaning," he said without looking up. Evelyn glanced toward the old boards he'd already pulled away. "I noticed. I know." That quiet answer settled somewhere warm inside her. The evenings stretched longer by March. Sunlight stayed across the valley, late enough to turn the snow gold before dark. Sometimes after supper, Noah carved wood beside the fire while Lucy slept curled against Evelyn's side beneath the quilt. And sometimes Cole simply sat there with them. No rushing off to the barn. No finding work that suddenly needed doing. Just sitting quietly in the same room while the fire cracked low between them. One Sunday after church, Martha Boone stopped Evelyn outside the general store while wagons rattled slowly through muddy snowmelt along Main Street. "You know, folks stopped talking scandal," Martha said, adjusting the gloves at her wrists. Evelyn smiled faintly. "What do they call it now?" Martha looked toward the mountains where Silver Creek sat beyond the ridge. "A family." The word followed Evelyn all the way home. A week later, Cole asked her to ride with him. They left near sunset beneath a sky streaked pale orange behind the mountains. Snowmelt dripped from cedar branches while the horses moved slowly up a narrow trail overlooking the valley. Cole spoke very little during the climb. Evelyn didn't press him. At the top of the ridge stood a small fenced plot beneath two pine trees bent by years of winter wind. One weathered cross. One name carved deep into old wood. Anna Mercer. Cole removed his hat. The wind moved quietly through the grass, beginning to push through melting snow. "She hated winters here," he said after a long silence. Said Montana felt too quiet. Evelyn stood beside him without speaking. Cole stared toward the valley below. "After she died, I got used to surviving instead of living." His voice stayed even, though his hand tightened once against the fence rail. Didn't seem much point in anything else. Below them, Silver Creek Ranch rested small beneath the fading light. Smoke drifted from the chimney, warm, waiting. Evelyn reached for his hand slowly. Not dramatic, not uncertain either. Just honest. Cole looked down at their hands together like he still couldn't quite believe it. He turned his hand and held hers tightly against the cold. Weeks later, the town gathered for the spring social beside the church hall. Lanterns swung above long wooden tables while children chased each other through muddy snow patches wearing Sunday shoes already ruined by spring thaw. Lucy sat proudly beside Martha Boo eating blackberry pie. "My mama makes better stew than anybody in Montana," she announced loudly enough for half the town to hear. For one brief second, silence circled the table. Then Martha only smiled into her coffee cup, and no one corrected her. That night, Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen rolling dough beneath warm lamplight while rain tapped softly against the windows. The ranch smelled of cinnamon, coffee, and fresh bread cooling near the stove. The front door opened. Cole stepped inside, carrying the damp scent of spring air and horses. He loosened his coat slowly and crossed to the stove where a pot simmered low over the fire. Without asking, he dipped the spoon once and tasted it. Evelyn folded her arms lightly. "Well?" Cole looked at her for a long moment. The fire painted soft gold across his face now instead of shadows. "Still think cooking's all you're good at?" he asked quietly. Evelyn smiled then. Small, real. Outside, snow slid softly from the edge of the barn roof into wet earth below. "No," she said. "I think I finally found where I belong." Cole stepped closer after that, not hurried, not afraid anymore. And somewhere beyond the windows, beyond the valley, and the long, hard winter that had nearly swallowed them whole, spring settled gently over Silver Creek Ranch at last. The house no longer felt cold, not anymore. And maybe that's what stayed with me most about Evelyn's story. Not the snow, not the contract. Not even the moment Cole stood in the middle of that frozen street and chose her in front of everyone. It was the quiet things, a warm kitchen after a hard winter, a little girl falling asleep against someone she finally trusted, a man learning there's a difference between surviving and living. Because truthfully, a lot of people know what it feels like to arrive somewhere carrying more hurt than luggage. To spend so long expecting disappointment that kindness almost feels harder to believe. And maybe if you'd stood where Evelyn once stood, cold, exhausted, unwanted, you would have done the same thing she did. You would have kept your chin up anyway. That's what makes a home sometimes. Not blood, not papers, not promises spoken too fast. Just people who stay, people who come back at supper time, people who notice when you're tired. People who leave a cup of coffee beside your hand without asking for anything in return. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you were listening from. Or simply leave a home in the comments. And if you'd like, stay a little longer with this channel. There are still more quiet towns, winter roads, lost souls, and healing hearts waiting beyond the next story.